Okay, so this is just a basic introduction to some of the concepts we'll be talking about as we move forward over the course of the semester. And in part is just intended to give you sort of a conceptual framework to help sort of organize some of these ideas and sort of understand some of the changes that we're going to be tracking as we look at the evolution of England. So to begin with geography, I love this map. It's a 12th century map from, we believe, Hereford. And one of the things I think that's really interesting about it, and I'm not sure if you can see the detail, so they've conceptualized their world as round, which is accurate, right? But also at the very center, that's Jerusalem. And so Jerusalem was often referred to as the navel of the world. And that, I think, gives you a sense of how their understanding of their religion sort of dictated their understanding of space. And obviously, you have Jesus sort of overseeing everything. So, this is very much a culture, a society that sort of organizes things according to this religious understanding, and in particular, their Roman Catholic understanding. But in terms of more basic geography, so this is the United Kingdom today, right? So this is what we're most familiar with. So you can see England is sort of the center of the island there. You have Wales off to the west, Scotland to the north, and then across you have sort of Ireland and Northern Ireland. So this same sort of territory then is going to sort of wax and wane over the course of the period that we're looking at until these boundaries become as distinct as they are today. So the first real sort of period we're going to look at and just touch on really briefly is sort of what's in Britain, this island, before it really starts to evolve into what we recognize as England. So you have Britannia, which is what it was referred to, what the Romans called it, and most of the terms we have for this early stuff actually comes from the Romans because these native tribes don't have written language. We have very few literary inscriptions, very few texts. So we do know that they are predominantly a Celtic people, though you also have some Scots and some Picts. So at this point, the Scots are actually over in Ireland and the Picts are up north, and then there's going to be a reconfiguration moving on. And then Roman Britain. So Julius Caesar is actually the first Roman to set foot on the island, but he's there really briefly, and then he returns to Gaul, which is what the Romans called modern day France. And then it's not until the Emperor Claudius in, I'm going to say 61 AD, that the Romans really led an organized invasion into the island, drawn by what they'd heard were rumors of incredible wealth, ores, precious jewels, gold. And so they were really interested in the natural resources that they thought Britannia had to offer. And so they encounter a lot of these different Celtic tribes. Some tribes are more welcoming than others. Some tribes make alliances with the Romans, and some individuals become actually quite Romanized. But a lot of them, particularly towards the north, are very resistant. They are opposed to any sort of Roman occupation or Roman influence, and we'll sort of look at how that plays out in a little bit. So by 450, Rome is pretty much out. They start to retreat in the 300s. By 410, they've got so many problems back in Italy that they're forced to pull their legions, for the most part, out of Britannia. And that doesn't mean that every Roman left. As I said, some people probably had intermarried with the local population. There were probably some soldiers who didn't necessarily leave. So it doesn't mean that they're completely gone. And certainly their legacy and their influence is going to linger for quite some time. So then the next major period we'll look at is Anglo-Saxon England. And so this is sort of a snapshot of what you see around 650. So after Rome leaves, there's this power vacuum. These Germanic, Anglo, and Saxon tribes, along with some Scandinavian Jutes, start to move in. And they really start in sort of the north, but also you can see sort of East Anglia there, so East Angles, and then Sussex, South Saxons. So they move in, and over the course of about 100, 200 years, they gradually establish control of the local Celtic population. A lot of the Celts are pushed west into what becomes Wales, and you can see the green territory there, and then also north. Some actually go across the channel into modern day Brittany, France. And then they sort of divide up into these 7 kingdoms, which we refer to as the Heptarchy. And those are going to be sort of the dominant political forces in England moving forward. So, one of the things I do want to bring your attention to, and I think this will become more evident as we sort of move through some of these phases, is that early on, really until 1066, the orientation of England is very much more towards the north. It's based on that Atlantic. So their connections, their influences are Scandinavian. They're not necessarily Western Europe and French. That obviously is going to shift post-Norman conquest, but really the culture of Anglo-Saxon England is really influenced by these Scandinavian peoples and what will become eventually these sort of Viking settlements that are going to happen towards the end of the Anglo-Saxon period. So the next major phase then is Norman England, which we date to the Norman conquest in 1066. So the last Anglo-Saxon king is defeated by William of Normandy, and then along with William, he brings a lot of his Norman followers, and they settle in England. And so this really does change the culture, changes the language. Anglo-Saxon English becomes obsolete amongst sort of the ruling class for a long time, and it really changes the connections between the English population and the Roman Catholic Church, and this orientation. So now England is going to be much more sort of connected to France, to other parts of Western Europe, than it is to Scandinavia. So there is continuity here. So unlike Anglo-Saxon England and Norman England, the Plantagenet dynasty is related to the Normans. So they're descendants, and we'll sort of parse out those relationships as we look at what happens with the Civil War at the end of the Norman period. But there is some change, and there's certainly administrative change, so that we talk about this period in the 12th century as ruled by the Plantagenet family. And another thing that happens is, so Norman England, you have England, and then you have the Duchy of Normandy, but it's under Henry II, the first Angevin king, that territory controlled by English kings really does extend much further. And you can see almost half, maybe 2/3 of France is actually controlled by the kings of England. And this is going to make for some really interesting geopolitics in the region. And then late medieval England, so gradually over the course of the 13th century, the Angevins, the Plantagenets, lose a lot of their territory on French soil. But then towards the end of the period, Hundred Years' War, they attempt to get it back. By 1485, though, they've really lost all of it. And so really they're just returned to English dominions, are confined to what's on the actual island of England. They have extended control into Wales and up into Scotland, but no longer really control any territory in France. So demography, so talking about just settlement, population, birth, death, some of that sort of data is obviously really tricky because we just don't have the records. There's no medieval equivalent. Well, I guess there is a medieval equivalent to the census. It's called Domesday, and we'll talk about that. But for the most part, on a yearly basis, Domesday is really a one-off thing that just happens after the conquest. But people don't keep the kind of birth records that we do. Most people wouldn't know how old they were. They'd maybe ballpark it within 5 years. They wouldn't know the day they were born. It's really hard to find that sort of specific demographic information for people. So the best we can do is sort of trends. So this gives you an idea of some of those population trends, so not really even being able to chart anything until post-conquest in 1088. But you can see this pretty steep rise in population, culminating right around sort of 1300, which actually coincides with a number of other factors. But unfortunately, that steep population increase resulted in England sort of exceeding its capacity, its agricultural capacity. And then there were some really nasty years around 1350, 1317 of drought and famine. And then obviously in the 1348, plague hits. So that explains that steep drop in the population. They don't get back to pre-plague levels for a considerable amount of time. And so when I talk about that census, so one of the things William the Conqueror, when he invades England, does is he sort of does this survey of all the manors in England. So size of a manor, annual income, how many people were living there, what taxes did they owe. And it becomes a really useful source for historians to kind of answer some of these questions about rural populations, urban populations. And one of the things that historians have been able to do is sort of locate at least the larger urban centers. So these are towns over 2,000. So that's pretty small. London obviously is a much larger population. York is pretty well populated. But other than that, even when you talk about an urban center in England during this period, these are pretty small population centers. So most of the population is living in rural areas on manors, at least until the 13th century. And this is sort of a contemporary map of medieval London. So it is pretty densely populated. You do have a very distinct urban culture that emerges around London, but it really is one of the few places that reach that sort of size. And it's one of the few places that really has this sort of diverse population in terms of people's professional trades, activities, and also settlement from other immigrant communities, particularly Flemings from what's now modern day Belgium. You also had small pockets of Jews that were brought in after the conquest, specifically by William the Conqueror. So it's a more diverse population. But it really is sort of an outlier. Most people in England would have lived in a place like this. So this is Warren Percy. So on the left, you see the actual what this village looks like today. It was deserted in the late Middle Ages, so it's actually really well preserved. And you can do a lot of things archaeologically to sort of learn more about what these villages looked like. On the right is sort of a modern day reconstruction. So you can see sort of the houses, you can see the layout very well, where the farms would have been, the different sort of elements of a medieval village. And this would have been familiar to a lot of people in the Middle Ages. And then life expectancy. Again, these are really, really tricky because we just don't have the records that we like. What we do know is that infant mortality rates were very, very high. Maybe 50% of infants born would have survived their first year. 0 to 5, very, very high mortality rates. Then things improve a bit. But we do know that the average medieval person, probably died between 35 and 40. And in part, this is because of the violence endemic in society, also for women, childbirth. Really did take its toll, and then obviously malnutrition and disease. And this also shows sort of when the population fell off the cliff. So around the 1300 mark with famine and then Black Death. So obviously not everyone was dying at 16, but you have so many people in those younger ages dying that it sort of skews those numbers. So in terms of chronology, this is just sort of to give you a sense of how we're going to sort of move through these different periods and track these different developments. So sort of Celtic Britain to 150, then Roman Britain to 410. We're really going to sort of focus our energies then are the remaining categories. So what happens in Britain between the Roman withdrawal and the arrival of the Anglo-Saxons, then Norman England, and culminating and spending a lot of our time on Plantagenet England. 1485 is when Richard III is killed at the Battle of Bosworth, and so that brings in the Tudors, which technically then is considered early modern. So the themes of the class, just to touch on these really briefly. So we're obviously going to track sort of religious developments because the Orthodox Catholic Church is really the only viable form of Christianity in Western Europe. It really is pervasive. So there's no separation of church and state. So it's just sort of permeates society and provides the backdrop to everything: politics, culture, war and diplomacy even. Obviously, the Crusades are motivated in part by these sort of this religious sort of fervor. So we'll look at a lot of these sort of activities surrounding war and diplomacy. Also, we'll talk about some of these questions of empires, particularly the scholarly tendency to refer to this Angevin Empire, and we'll sort of query that. To what extent is it an empire, the way we understand empires? Also, the evolution of this political system over the course of the period in time, and in conjunction with that, this very unique legal system that develops in England with the English common law. And then over all of these phases and these changes and the introduction of new peoples and practices and cultures, how do we get to this unique sort of English identity that really is visible, I would say, by 1300. So the last category I want to touch on is just sources. How do we know what we know? And how do we navigate some of the challenges that are posed by medieval sources? So obviously written sources are going to dominate the conversation. Texts, and they have a lot of advantages because they're very detailed. They give you a lot of information, but they also have to be very carefully navigated. So this is a particularly well-known text. It is Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. This is one of the earliest written manuscripts to have survived. It's in the British Library today, and it dates to the 15th century. So it was probably written down just shortly after Chaucer first started circulating his Canterbury Tales. And for those of you familiar with this is incredibly satirical. So you really can't just read it as this is the way it was. Chaucer was trying to amuse his audience. So you really have to try and consider what an author was trying to do, what is reality, what is exaggerated, and they have to be very carefully sort of navigated. Slightly more straightforward, but perhaps more subjective, are ecclesiastical works. So sermons, so what a priest would have preached at a local church on Sunday. Theological treatises, so something written by Augustine or Aquinas that sort of talks about particular issues within Catholic theology. So obviously these are very, again, detailed, very, very useful in that respect, but the issue is obviously perspective and the extent to which what a priest would have preached in a Sunday sermon is actually reflective of any sort of reality. Pipe rolls are another really interesting source for England, and scholars have been able to mine these for a lot of specific data. So they literally were rolls. All of this stuff is written on parchment. This is animal skins. It's very durable. But it's also very expensive. So that's why they write in teeny tiny little script. And so these were just accounts, taxation accounts, household expenses, what was spent on what. So this much on grain this month, this much on corn, this much on wine, how many barrels of wine. So it's really basic information. It's good because it's really straightforward. There's not a lot of subjectivity here, but it also doesn't give us a wider context. It doesn't provide a sort of a sense of purpose. They really are these sort of straightforward household accounts or taxation accounts, and you have to use them very carefully. And then charters. So charters would have been they're almost like a receipt, a medieval receipt. So if there was an economic transaction that you were involved in, a charter would be written up as sort of a way to account for that transaction, all the people involved, what happened, and then you can see the seal. So that's sort of the equivalent to the medieval signature. So if I issued the charter, I would attach my seal as a way of saying, yeah, this was issued by me, so it's legitimate. Again, very straightforward, very little bias or subjectivity, but economic transactions. I gave land to this particular abbey, or I gave 20 goats to a particular nunnery. So a lot of sort of economic detail, but again, don't provide a lot of sense of sort of the wider day-to-day within society. So you do have artistic images. These can be very useful. This is one of the more famous sort of images from the Middle Ages. This is sort of a personal devotional text that was commissioned in the 15th century for the Duc de Berry in France. And it depicts the months. And it has all of these sort of peasant scenes. So you can kind of get a glimpse of what a peasant village would have looked like. But this is an illustration in a book for a very, very wealthy man. So they're not really going to show you the nitty gritty of peasant life here. So again, you have to navigate it carefully, but you can get a sense of how people lived, what they would have worn, the different components of a manor, and things like that. Perhaps one of the most famous illuminations is the Bayeux Tapestry, and we'll be looking at this in much greater detail moving forward. So this is an embroidery. It's really, really long, and it was commissioned after the conquest to sort of tell the story pictorially of the conquest of England by William. And so it does give us these really fascinating little glimpses into sort of military technology of the time, what naval warfare looked like, what feasting looked like, how people dressed. You can see, we know that Normans sort of shaved their head in the back. They had these sort of strange bowl cuts. So little glimpses of what people would have looked like and how they would have lived can be gleaned from some of these images. Similarly, illuminated manuscripts. So these manuscripts that would include pictures. This one I think is particularly interesting because the manuscript, the text, was actually the work of Christine de Pizan, who was writing in the French court in the 15th century. And when Christine, so Christine was commissioned to produce this text. When she produced it, she actually had the person who did the illuminations include her. So this is actually a picture of Christine writing the manuscript. So it does a few different things in interesting ways, again, to fill in some of these visual gaps that are otherwise lacking because we don't have photos, we don't have video, we don't have any of those sort of modern glimpses into medieval life. Material culture is also something that I think more and more scholars are trying to engage in their work. This is the Melisande Psalter, so it's the 12th century. It was commissioned for Queen Melisande of Jerusalem, and it's kind of hard to see, but this is a carved ivory cover of a book that was given to Melisande, and it is different depictions of biblical scenes, but with a particular spin. So the king and queen in this particular sort of illustration are supposed to be sort of modeled on Melisande and her husband. So again, using some of these artistic representations, we can add to sort of what the texts tell us. Also coins and seals. So these are all seals, but again, these are what you put on a document, a charter, to authenticate it. And the iconography here also tell a story if you look very closely into how people dressed, who these people were. There are a lot of different symbols that art historians can use to try and get a sense of, obviously, the nobility, but how they identified themselves. Some other great sort of material sources are things that people are literally finding buried in the ground. One of the more recent finds was the Staffordshire hoard. So you have this is not uncommon in England, that people will go around with metal detectors, and particularly vacant fields or open spaces. And every now and then they stumble across these huge sort of hoards that had been buried by particularly Vikings or Anglo-Saxons, and it's precious metals, it's gold, it's jewels. A lot of the times they're fragments because they would have melted them down at some point. But this is a way for people who were moving around to sort of store their wealth. They obviously didn't have banks. And these fragments, though, give us an incredible amount of insight into some of these pre-1000 populations. Also, we have archaeological investigations. This is actually a recent sort of investigation into a cemetery next to a church in the 14th century. And archaeologists can go and they can do dating and they can figure out when these people died and what these people died from. And one of the things that this tells us, which is kind of surprising, is that people who died of the plague, you can see that they were actually buried. They were carefully buried. And a lot of texts don't really reflect that. They're more like mass graves. But also, you can determine how old these people were when they died, their sort of nutritional status when they died. And it gives you a lot of insight into actually how they lived. Archaeological structures. Obviously, we're really familiar with some of the Gothic churches and the sculpture, which also give us sort of a sense of what people look like, different symbols. This is the tomb of Queen Melisende. You saw her psalter earlier. So this is outside of Jerusalem. And the structure on the right is the way it looks when you enter the church today. If you go down the stairs into that vault, this is the site associated with the burial of the Virgin Mary. But before you get to the very bottom, which is the altar dedicated to Mary, you get the tomb of Queen Melisende. And so you can also use these actual existing structures to learn a lot about the culture and the people of the Middle Ages. This is another super interesting excavation. And again, it's, I think, a great example of how we're constantly learning. So this is a Viking warrior grave from Birka, Sweden, dates to about 8th century. It's kind of hard to see what's in there, but there's a skeleton of a horse. There's a human skeleton. There's clearly implements that suggest that this person was a warrior. And this was discovered a long time ago, like 18th century, 19th century. But at the time, they just assumed, based on assumptions, that it was a male. And only recently have archaeologists gone back and done testing on the skeleton, the human skeleton, and they've been able to determine that, in fact, it was a woman. So you had a female Viking warrior. There's a lot of discussion about the extent to which women participated in warfare during that period. And this sort of provides this scientific proof that they did, in fact, exist. And then similarly, biomedical archaeology is a really growing field. This is, I think, an incredible example of the use of scientific investigation to tell us more about history. So what you have in the left is actually a tooth. They found this tooth in the skeleton of a nun who was buried near a convent in Germany. And when they investigated it, they found the presence of this blue, which is lapis lazuli. And this is a particular stone that comes from the East. It's really, really rare. It had to be imported. And we know that this lapis lazuli was very commonly used in pigments used to illustrate manuscripts after about 1200 in Western Europe. And you can see the prevalence of the blue lapis in that image. The question is, when you have these manuscripts that are being produced, who's producing them? And until very recently, the assumption was it was all men. But then when they discovered this lapis in this tooth of this nun skeleton, the only way you could have had that concentration is if she was physically in proximity using this dye on a regular basis. So this is one way that we can use science to actually tell us about history and to make a correction to the historiographical record that often is informed by our assumptions about what people would have done. So a lot of these different sort of sources, these different sort of techniques moving forward, I think will continue to provide additional insight, make corrections to the existing historical record, and just tell us more about the Middle Ages.